The daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Yeah. The daughters of Zelophehad came forward. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent meeting. And they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves against the Lord, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan? Because he has no sons. Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." So Moses brought their case before God. This scripture from Numbers, you may remember from Never. And that's, sir. Honestly, if you had heard of it, it would be a miracle. I found it because I was gathering with the Methodist pastors in our network, which is required until recently. And we were discerning this sermon series, and we're looking for, people who spoke up, but you don't, they're, underrated. They're not the normal voices. They're not the names that, make the headlines or get in the lights. And so I think we Googled a variety of things, including, people in the Bible you've never heard of. And Zelophehad's daughters popped right up. So we found this spot in Numbers and then started looking at all of the commentaries and resources that we could find and a few scholarly articles that do exist about this spot in Numbers, but apparently 4 years in seminary, nobody ever thought about it. The daughters of Zelophehad, it comes in this spot when the people of Israel have left enslavement in Egypt. They have wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. They have gotten a bit whiny on occasion, and they have made it to the edge, to the preface, they are about to enter the promised land. They have conquered, which is probably complicated. They have maybe reconquested this land that they felt was theirs, this land flowing with milk and honey, and they are about to go in, these formerly enslaved people who have wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And Moses, with God's help, and all of the elders, they're discerning how to distribute the land, right? And so everybody's working together and talking together, and it turns out that all of the tribes of Israel get a plot of land, except the priestly tribe, because they've got a different job and they don't need to farm. Makes sense. They get assigned to cities, right? They just talk. So useful. So all of the tribes that do work have these plots of land. And they take a census. It's the second census in the time of the wilderness, right? Like censuses. Everybody's got them. And so they do the census, and they figure out which tribes have the most people, and they divide the land according to who needs the most land. It's very equitable. And so they're all moving forward. God has blessed this, affirmed this. Everybody's happy. They're in the tent. They're making decisions. People are like, huzzah. The elder generation is not allowed to go into the promised land because they were too whiny in the wilderness, I guess, which I'm sorry. That's a whole other sermon. I'm not sure. And in the midst of this, 5 daughters whose father has died and they have no brothers, come forward. And they just throw a wrench in the whole plan. And they enter the tent, this space where all of the important people are making decisions. And I suspect they are the only women. And I suspect they're probably among the youngest people there because that's how decision-making usually happens. And so it says they come forward and they name earnestly their case. And Israel is setting up this equitable distribution of land, and they are very clearly patrilineal. They are a patriarchy. The land is distributed through the male heirs. But what if you don't have a son? And so it's complicated. And these 5 daughters use the patriarchy against the patriarchy, and they say, don't let our father's name be taken away. And everybody's like, ooh, we didn't think about that. And they ask this question in front of God and everybody, because God and everybody has decided this is how the land will be distributed. And Moses pauses to his credit, and he goes and he prays, and he takes their question to God. It's a big deal that they come forward at all. Other people who come forward and name their concerns, it doesn't end very well. There's a group of folks who come forward just before this. They don't really care for the direction things are going with Moses' leadership, and then the earth swallows them up. Yeah. Miriam and Aaron come forward with a bit of a complaint. Does God only speak through Moses? I don't think so. And then Miriam gets leprosy. Yeah, it's a situation. They whine in the wilderness like, oh, at least in Egypt, I know we might have been facing genocide and they were trying to kill our babies, but at least we had meat. There was meat, and so God sends a plague. Like, it's through, like, bad meat, of all things. Anywho, it's rough. It's a rough time in the wilderness, and it's sort of a rough and messy and imperfect story. The women, these 5 daughters, come forward, and God says to Moses, they're right. Their cause is right. They're righteous. And so they are granted property rights. Now, there are neighboring city-states and communities where women do inherit property at this time in history, one of those being Egypt, where they just left. And it may not be the same or equitable, but this little glimpse of equity maybe creates a case for future cases to be made. And these 5 daughters are remembered. Their names are remembered. They are written throughout the Bible, well, at least twice, which you may think is no big deal, but there are plenty of women who don't get their names mentioned anywhere. There is a space in the New Testament where a woman anoints Jesus, and he says, this is so important. Anytime the gospel is preached, it will be done in remembrance of her. Her name will be shared, and Jesus Christ himself cannot get people to keep that woman's name in the Bible. But we know all 5 daughters. It comes up again. These women, they get the right to own property. They also, because they own property, have the right to decide who they marry, which is a pretty big deal. It comes up again a few chapters later because their uncles and cousins and all of the men are like, hey, what if these women marry someone from another tribe? What happens then? And so Moses, probably sighs and was like, oh, I didn't think about that. And says, can you just marry someone from your tribe? And there's this midrash from the rabbis, and there's this feminist rabbi who imagines that the women live 40 years happily, and then they marry, and then they have a baby who's a boy, and they're at 130 at this point, and everything's grand. And they got to choose the cream of the crop because they bring not just a dowry, but a property. The reason it matters who they marry is because of the year of Jubilee. Because the tribe has this process so that if something goes bad, you have a bad harvest, you have some bad decisions, the weather is wrong, the loan is a problem, everybody has some struggles, and you have to sell your land or you lose it. The family doesn't lose their farm. Every 50 years it goes back to the tribe to be redistributed. It is a structure, the year of Jubilee, to redistribute wealth. The Hebrew people imagined this structure of redistributing wealth before they even have it. before they even have the land, before they have even set foot and divided the promised land among themselves, whether they are 5 daughters or sons or anybody else. This is an invitation, this story. These daughters came forward in an unlikely place with tremendous courage to speak a little bit of hope into the world for themselves, for needs that are real and everyday, and for every daughter that followed. May we have the courage to do the same. May it be so. Amen.
My name is Jeff, and according to some of the staff at the Urban Abbey, if I was a Parks and Rec character, I would be Mark Brandanowitz, who's our planner. So now you know a little bit about me, I guess. Deborah asked me to speak, kind of give a list of dates and topics, and one of the topics was on economic justice, and I thought to myself, talk about economic justice in this economy? Not a good idea. But the reality is like that idea that the economy isn't working for some has been the case as long as we've been a country. Before that, like, it wasn't working. So I thought we should maybe think about Jesus and kind of his first introduction to speaking in kind of a sermon, and that's Luke chapter 4, where the first thing he says is like, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to come and proclaim good news to the poor, and reclaim sight for the blind, free the oppressed. And so his identity from the beginning has always been linked to proclaiming good news to the poor. And for us to think about that, I want us to think about kind of why is it that to understand sort of who Jesus is, we need to really reflect on God's deep concern for those that are trapped in cycles of poverty. And so Jesus in that introduction in Luke, he's, for those that would have been listening would have known this is coming from the book of Isaiah, where it's time to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And that idea of the year of the Lord's favor, they would have known is this idea of the year of Jubilee. So we talked about Numbers, and now we're going to move to another super exciting book in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. Okay, I'm not even that excited about it. Thank you, appreciate that. So in chapter 15, God is looking ahead to people's life in the Promised Land, and says there will not be, like literally, no poor among you. There should not be poor people among you. But then just a little bit later, just 7 verses later in that chapter, he concedes there will always be poor amongst you. So, 1, there should never be poor among you. Secondly, there's always going to be poor among you. Like, this is a tension here that is the reality of as long as we've been people living together. That is really caused, this idea of poverty is caused by greed and maintaining wealth at the top and maintaining systems of oppression. So the idea of Jubilee in Deuteronomy, he's saying like this is more than just your personal good works. You just like try a little harder to help the poor. It's a moral command, but it's also supposed to be systematically put into our laws and policy. That would sort of codified in the systems to ensure that those that are stuck in poverty have a way out. So the 4 features of this idea of Jubilee, that the law was designed to work together to end poverty, is 1, that money lenders, so people that are the lenders, should not charge interest. 2, tithes that are given need to be given to the migrants, the poor, the orphans, widows. Every 7 years, any debt that we have would be forgiven. And then every 50th year, the idea of Jubilee, that all land, which is, since then, land ownership has been the cornerstone for wealth creation, that should be given back to its ancestral owners. And it should be noted that this is what they've said. There's no record of this ever actually happening. It was a good idea, but when it comes time to actually redistribute this, it's too hard for us to do. We need maybe more imagination. So this idea God had to redistribute resources to people is something that's been with us from the beginning of time. And I remember when Barack Obama was running for president, there was this affiliation he had, this idea of redistributing wealth. And that was really scary to a lot of people, and there's a lot of push to vote against him because he's going to take all of your money and give it to someone else. The reality is that redistribution of wealth has been happening for a long time. It's just going the other direction. And no matter who is in office, they will always tout this great economy and jobs. But when you actually look at it, the economy isn't working for everyone. There is a majority of people in our country that hold sort of negative wealth, that their debt exceeds the value of their assets. 40% of Americans today aren't able to have $400 set aside for an emergency. And we talk about the census, according to the census data, so if you're a black individual is their median wealth is 41 times smaller than the median wealth of a white individual in our country. So this economy isn't working. It's working for the richest 5% that own 3/4 of the wealth of our country. It's made for corporations that aren't maybe paying their share of taxes. It works for people. All presidents, Donald Trump, Barack Obama. Donald Trump made $430 million last year. It's working for him, evidently. This redistribution of wealth is going to those at the top of the ladder. And so I was thinking about that, and this idea of Jubilee, and it reminded me of this idea of reparations. It's been talked about for some time. And I had sort of come across that many years ago. I remember an article in the Atlantic that I had to kind of look up again by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who sort of talked about explaining this case for reparations, and that it sort of begins with housing discrimination, these web of kind of racist structures. And that article begins with a quotation from this book of Deuteronomy about Jubilee. So he's linking those two together. It is a parallel that sort of he identified, and I think we'd be wise to think about too. So the idea of Jubilee is that regardless of your circumstance, how you ended up in poverty, we'd start over again. And in our country today, we don't have to sort of wonder what the circumstances are that cause people to be in poverty. It's well documented, sort of beginning with land and how we acquired land in our country from indigenous people. There is mass incarceration, redlining, predatory lending. We could go on and on. But Jesus he says he's instructing us in the prayer that he's teaching everyone to recite, the Lord's Prayer. There's a line to forgive our debts, so that's what we are asked to do. So if those are things that are preventing Jubilee from happening, we might be thinking about what would actions that we could take that might bring about an essence of Jubilee. And so, there's a few items. We can start by providing legal protection against evictions for everyone. We can think about, as developments occurring, sort of development agreements between communities so that everyone benefits long-term from reinvestment in communities that have been disinvested for some time. Where we work, we can think about the companies that we work for. There could be shared ownership models and sort of new strategies around compensation and who we hire and the type of skills and where we go to recruit people to work at these places and their backgrounds. We can give people new second and third chances. We can invest in neighborhoods and businesses that are owned by women and minorities. We can look for we can get into housing, which is often very much exploitative, and try to reimagine new solutions for that. Then we can get into policy. We could be supporting, we've talked about it today, a few bills that we can be a part of and testify. You can run for office in Omaha. You can be supporting bills and actions that increase access to work, access to opportunity. And one that comes to mind is metro transit. So our public transportation, often people that don't really not prefer to own a vehicle or can't afford to own a vehicle, or their vehicle is just in the shop, they rely on public transportation to move from work or grocery to home. And this next year, the Metro Transit of Omaha is going to be an elected position. And so March 1st is the deadline to apply, to file to run for that position, because currently there are people that are filing to run for that office with the goal of sort of eliminating funding for it, because I think it's a waste of taxpayer funding. So we need people to run for that office. So you have till March 1st to file to run. It's all, if you live in Omaha, you live in a district that needs a position to represent. So we can do that. So all that to say, like there's ideas out there. We have good communities we can look towards. And to go back to that article in the case of reparations, Coates brings up just something very simple we could do, because he says that many well-meaning people in the United States would say, I sort of support this idea of reparations, but just the logistics of how that could come to be, I don't know how that would work. So he mentions that since 1989, a senator, Congressman John Coyers, has been H.R. 40, has been introducing a bill in Congress just to put a committee together to sort of unpack how that would go. Well, that's never actually made its way into law. So we have these well-meaning intentions, but to follow it up by action is where we can, I think, make an impact. So think about this, like the idea of Jubilee is one that we can join in God's desire to upend systems of oppression. We can reject those places where there's inequality and put in solutions of equity. In the song, which was brought up, the abundant life, that we hear that Jesus says, like, I'm here to bring life and life abundant, and I'm also here to ask you to love your neighbor as yourself. These are ways that we can take action and demonstrate love for our neighbor by putting it into action. So I just want to end by thinking about a quote from Dr. John Perkins, who he passed away a few years ago, but he was sort of right in with Dr. Martin Luther King in the civil rights. And when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the church sort of said, all right, Dr. John Perkins, you are like sort of tasked with carrying forth the work of racial reconciliation. And so when he's thinking about this, he says that our love is our witness, and our love is the ultimate fight for reconciliation. So may we be people that are working in our own communities and our families and on ourselves to work towards love that repairs all relationships. May we have the courage. Amen.